We're also going to talk about the fact that the National Council decided this Tuesday that they want to recommend to refuse the judiciary initiative and that they won't make another proposition, a counter proposal. So you either decide in favor of vote in favor of the judiciary initiative or for the current system. So the National Council has already decided, it's going to be decided in the Council of State. So before we start, I see that Mr. Voskuhle, Mr. Grimm, and Ms. Nussberger are still part here. They're actually not officially taking part in our panel discussion, but if you want to introduce your considerations from an external point of view, you're very welcome to participate. So I think that everybody except from Mr. Meyer today agree that re-election are a source of danger. So, Mr. Meyer, what do you say about a one election process and the possibility of impeachment? No, I wouldn't refuse that system. But I don't actually welcome changes that are not necessarily necessary. I don't see that these changes are necessary. Mr. Übersachs asked me a question. I would like to answer it quickly. They said that the Federal Supreme Court doesn't understand that they don't understand why the Federal Supreme Court wants that they are involved in the appointment of judges or considered. So the problem is that the list of candidates goes to the administrative courts at the moment in the current system, and these courts then make a statement about the quality of the candidates. Now that leads to the circumstance that people that are not qualified cannot be appointed as candidates. So I think that that is the system for the administrative courts, and it should be applied to the Supreme Court as well, because I think we know what qualification needs for our posts. Thank you very much. Maybe not only that the federal court, they theoretically, of course, know what the areas of responsibility is, but maybe the court where the candidates come from knows whether they're qualified. So when it comes to the judiciary initiative, Mr. Gasser, you said that the impeachment process that goes along the judiciary initiative is an element to improve the democratic legitimation. That is clear. But then the initiative suggests that the Federal Assembly, that it should go through the Federal Assembly on the request of the Federal Council. What do you say? In this matter, the initiators would like to be more precise. We are part of the state, we are part of Switzerland. We don't want to change everything from scratch. This is not necessary. But if to our surprise, it is said that the democratic legitimation isn't realized in the qualified lot process, I must say that if there are weak points, or if there is a problem about the values, if a large part of the population cannot assess the values of a judge, then the parliament, which is actually elected by the people, should assess whether a judge is apt for his or her office or not. Now, I want to point out that it's about that this is all about the right of a litigant before the legal instances, because people looking for justice today, and I think the discussion shows this, have the impression that the jurisdiction or the judiciary has lost its connection to the people and the population, the people. It only reports to God himself and has no other ground or legitimation. So I think that our proposition improves that circumstance. If you talk about democratic legitimation, and if you say there is something that is not supportive in the Swiss mentality, you can, or in the mentality of the judges, you can tell them to speak an oath. Well, I don't want to touch the academic field about that, but our judiciary initiative received 130 signatures. And that shows that the trust in the judiciary of the people isn't given anymore. That there is an impression that the judiciary and the politics are too much intertwined, that they build a political class which distributes its power among themselves, and that they are all united on a Titanic, on a sinking Titanic, but doesn't listen or protect the third-class people. Mr. Meyer would like to make a statement about that. Mr. Meyer. Thomas, is it okay? Mr. Gasser, there is a contradiction in your line of argumentation. You say that we, the federal judges, are intertwined with who knows whom. I never was. I never was for 34 years. I have never reported to anybody about my rulings. I don't know where you got this impression from. And on the other side, you say that the judges live on a different planet, that they lost their connection to the people. For me, this contradicts each other. So do you know any concrete examples where authorities or where judges listened or were influenced by authorities? Are there rulings you know which clearly were clearly influenced by other branches? And I have to tell you, I don't live on the moon. I live in Lucerne, and I know that people there trust the judiciary. I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you. I would like to have a different discussion because we're not doing politics here. What I would like to talk about is that we have statements from Greco, we have statements from the first part of our conference which say that there is need for change. And we have arguments on the table that show what we could do to change the situation. And I would rather talk about that than about the political grounds. Could I just make a quick remark as an answer to Mr. Meyer? I would just like to briefly point upon the following fact. The NZZ, which is a leading paper, were advised for many decades never criticize a ruling of the Federal Supreme Court. 4 or 5 years ago, this newspaper wrote that there is a regulation of authorities that doesn't that influences the judges so that they can't pass rulings in a certain matter. So the Federal Supreme Court is the extended arm of the executive. And if you take the case Donsala, they didn't just decide independently, but it was aligned with the Federal Finance, Department of Finance, which was led by Mr. Maurer. That was also that was also aligned with the party values of the Swiss Popular Party. Also, your influence could suit to talk about certain rulings in the Swiss in the Swiss TV. So that's a very important matter. We are limited in time, and I have to interrupt you. I'm sorry. It is quite difficult to host this discussion because I would like to have a structured discussion. So we wanted to talk about re-election and impeachment. We saw that there are two models which we can discuss in its concrete implementation. Now, here's a question to the observer from the outside. In Switzerland, the judges are elected according to party ratios because they say that this represents the values or the opinions of the people. So Switzerland doesn't have this system. Does it mean that we don't have a diversity of fundamental values at the courts, or what do you say? Thank you very much. I don't think that we lack diversity of judges. The Federal Constitutional Court has this established way of electing judges. We also have the election of judges for the highest offices, and for the lower courts, there is no party influence. But I don't think that we lack diversity because of that. I'd rather say that today, not all our citizens feel represented by parties. I think Mr. Gasser said that we need to ask ourselves how many people the parties actually represent, because there are many people who don't feel represented by parties, and they would need to be represented in the court too. I think that the independence of courts is very much dependent on how we assess them, their independence. Of course, diversity is important, but we can reach this diversity in other processes too. And last but not least, we need to pay attention to the misbelief that diversity is the only guarantee for a fair trial or ruling. I am pro-diversity, of course, men, women, political, religious, sexual orientations, but just because somebody has a particular sexual orientation or political stance, they can still understand other people's situations and living conditions, because if we don't believe that that only, for example, a gay person can rule over gay people, or Christians over Christians over Christians, we couldn't believe in our legal system anymore. Peter, I think you want to complement what she said, because you say that the judges have to, because the judges still have a worldview. I have to unmute myself. As I already said, we need to know the judges we appoint. We can also establish a professional committee that only checks the the professional qualification, and then we also lack diversity. Lack of diversity is also always a problem, no matter from which point of view. It doesn't matter which political view or world view we talk about. So I'm convinced that the candidates need to talk about their values and about their political stance on, for example, abortion or the division of tasks in a partnership and so on. So I don't know how to assess that in the end. That's another question. But I think that we need this transparency in the election process of judges, because like that, I think that we will achieve a representation, a diverse representation of our population or people. So, Ms. Sanders, what do you say? Mr. Voskuhle would like to say a few words. Yes, Mr. Voskuhle, please. The floor is yours. I would just like to make a small remark. If you say we don't know the judges we appoint, in the Federal Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe, we made the experience that seemingly conservative people were elected to the court, and then they turned out to be quite revolutionary, and vice versa. So I think it's very difficult to make a prognosis on what people decide when they can decide independently. So I just wanted to share my experience with that question. Thank you very much. So I would like to say a few words about that. I completely agree, but this is not a fundamental problem from my point of view. I think that judges should think independently and develop. But at the starting point, at the beginning, there should be a certain transparency at the point of election, of course. But of course, then we can't influence how people develop. This goes without saying. I agree. Anne, what do you say? I would like to relate to that. I think I wouldn't want to make a prognosis. What I like about the appointment, or what I think is difficult about the appointment of judges in the US, is that in the processes where they are questioned, everything what they ever wrote and ever said is examined, and I think that this goes too far. I think that the values of the judges are important, and we need to aspire to have a variety of personalities in a judicial board. But I think that the people should, the person themselves should be able to develop. Mr. Meyer, you said that in your long work at the Supreme Court, the judgments were never passed along party lines. So how can you actually justify or make an assessment on whether rulings are passed according to party lines? Well, actually, I completely agree with you. I always told the Judicial Commission, you need to admit candidates which don't belong to a party if they are professionally qualified. Of course, we would have great problems with the European Convention on Human Rights if it was binding or mandatory that candidates for a judicial office need to be member of a political party. But in the current political system, it is actually the case that the seats for the Supreme Court are distributed between the parties, and they do not want to appoint judges which are not part of a party. And Peter, you know from your own experience, because you have been serving on the court for a long time and you are not part of a party. In 1943 was the only time that a judge was elected not being part of a party. I don't know which party he paid to. I'm sorry, Mr. Gasser. There was another very important judge in family law who afterwards went back to university, and he wasn't part of a party. When Mr. Schubert was professor, then he wanted to become a judge in Basel. Then he asked what party he needs to join. And then they said the Swiss Democratic Party, and he joined that party. It didn't correspond to his values, but it helped him to become federal Supreme Judge. And then he was thrown out by lobbyists, not by the parliament which elected him. And of course, we can ask ourselves, why did the parliament accept that the federal judges worked as a club who were able to throw out their own member? Because that would have been the task of the United Federal Assembly. Well, that shows that there is an entanglement of these two branches, and that we need to renew and refresh our system and reflect our system. I very much agree with the scientific representatives and also with the proposition of Peter Übersachs. If there is a will to implement independence and to have a more professionality, then we want to talk about it. But this proposition was refused by the Federal Council because they said and argued that the Federal Council was against this, and the Federal Court as well, not giving a counter proposition. Now, I know federal judges who weren't present at this vote. Now, what I ask you is whether the federal judges, which were freely voted, are they part of a club or association? So a litigator, somebody looking for a judge is a normal person, an average citizen, a taxpayer. Well, this person has no chance to stand against the judiciary, which is led by the authorities and influenced by the legislative. So we have no power against this system. And it doesn't. You are right with your examples about Mr. Schubert. There was a problem. We already talked about it today. And you also talk about it in your initiative, that there is the possibility of impeachment. We don't have that yet in the Federal Supreme Court. We only have it in the other lower instances.
I would like to ask another question. You mentioned the expert commission and the judicial initiative. You said they should vet their pre-selection much better and prepare it much more intensely. And then the Federal Assembly has to say yes. They can say yes or reject, but they cannot take someone else. Why in the end is that still necessary? If there is such a selection, then just like the initiative suggests, the perfect person, the appropriate person could just go, and the assembly could roll with it, basically. It's a question of democratic feedback to me. I would like to tell you an anecdote. Last fall, I took part or listened to a Zoom conference. It was about an English court the High Court. He gave a talk. It was a very exciting presentation, quite fun actually, I must admit. But then the question came up as to what benefit Europe brought according to British legislation. Well, from continental Europe, they received proportionality. That was something they were taught. He didn't say they were forced to do it. It sounded like it was something they felt forced to. He said they were taught proportionality as a concept. And this does not reflect British tradition at all. And he said that he had a problem with it, because when authorities' decision needed to be checked for proportionality, then he is a norm judge, but in the end it's the authority to decide, and they need democratically elected members. And that really opened my eyes. A judge, him or herself, can tell themselves to be modest, to maybe hold back because they are not democratically elected. So the judge thinks how they can vet a decision coming from a body that is democratically elected. And I believe in Switzerland we have a special feeling for that democratic legitimacy, and this has to do with our state system, with the democratic mechanisms that we have and that we're proud of, rightly so, I must say. This is a long tradition in Switzerland. And now saying the expert commission is to decide, or it's a decision in a lottery, then I'm convinced that we continue to need the Federal Assembly, but the political influences need to be defined. And I believe the political parties shouldn't be able to exert as much influence. They could still do it if they continue to submit the suggestions. And it has to be an election after all. But then the expert commission would come with their own suggestions. So, I mean, I presented my model and I'm convinced of it. And we have different models in Switzerland and in Germany. And I pointed to Mr. Tschentscher's PhD thesis. He talked about this chain of legitimacy going back to Roman Herzog. And it was really well defined. Tschentscher said it wouldn't fit to the judiciary. This chain of democratic legitimacy wouldn't fit, because let's say someone doesn't fit anymore, then this person would have to be removed from office, and this isn't something we want. So Mr. Tschentscher says the actual democratic legitimacy for the judiciary is to be found in the Constitution, in the legal text. Now, I believe that this has never been taken up in Switzerland. Maybe that's a topic for the German colleagues then. Ms. Sanders, I believe that this discussion of the democratic legitimacy is something we cannot avoid in Germany. I believe that this is a good discussion that should be conducted. And these questions pertaining to the re-election process, they're quite complicated. But whenever we work on these standards, how can we anchor these standards? Is it a rather more general standard? And many countries think that the judges' democratic legitimacy could not be demanded because of these reasons. Because they say we need to separate powers and we should take politics out of it. We should keep it separate. Of course, there should be a selection before election. We mentioned Article 18 from CCJE. Some countries choose a way of democratic legitimacy, but the judges' democratic legitimacy could actually come from the constitution and from the legal text. So I believe that the national constitutional traditions are still a good foundation. I don't believe this will prevail in Switzerland because they have their own tradition and they don't seem to be able to get away from it. We could go back to Mr. Übersachs's model suggestion and also discuss what was said before, also by Mr. Grimme. Mr. Grimm, can I make a follow-up question? The Constitutional Court in Wiesbaden, why did it question its own legitimacy? Because it was a federal state and it wasn't legitimized by a parliament and it wasn't democratically elected? Am I mistaken? No, the administrative court in Wiesbaden asked itself, because it wasn't elected by a parliament, but it was appointed by the Minister of Justice, and therefore it developed this thought. And I mentioned these standards, Venice Commission, CCJE, you name it, and they see a completely independent judicial committee as the golden standard. That's a new tradition, and it's a discussion that has been conducted by German prosecutors and lawyers, or the judiciary as such. Traditional democratic legitimacy needs to be developed without political interference. In Switzerland, it's really frowned upon to have the executive appoint courts. This is not seen as independent. Yes, that's this traditional link, which we also need, because Europe cannot be a continent where everything works and is done the same. And I mean, you can criticize me, no problem. My field of expertise is in civil law, but we have the election, the parliamentarian, the minister. This needs to be a chain without interruptions until it reaches the executive. And in Switzerland, we say election by the people or by parliament. We have 10 more minutes. And for the final round, I would like to mention some buzzwords, and then you can decide which buzzword to take up, what you want to discuss. Peter, what you said, you mentioned the Federal Council and their suggestions and the capabilities of the Federal Assembly, and there was a clear no, and the election was confirmed in the end. And that's actually a confirmation of what you just said. We received many questions. You have covered many questions before. But maybe we can take up some aspects. Appointment for life, that's a nice buzzword. Fixed retirement age. What do you think about anonymized applications? Many questions pertaining to the judge's legitimacy, the judge's beliefs and attitudes. Can a judicial committee only assess judicial expertise, or can it also assess other fields of expertise? And a question, because we heard so many different suggestions and we got so many ideas. Without constitutional changes or amendments, what can be implemented immediately? Couldn't the Judicial Committee solve these deficits itself? So these questions could be shed light upon from different perspectives. And the Council could work on different bodies. So what could the judiciary do itself? So we receive many different questions, and maybe you can pick specific buzzwords and share your thoughts. So who should start? Now I see Thomas Stadelmann speaking, but he is muted. Let's start with Mr. Meyer, because he was the first to deliver his speech, and then we can continue with Ms. Sanders, like we had on the agenda. Ulrich, do you want to start? I believe that the work of the Judicial Council and its cooperation can be improved without having to change laws. I believe this is a doable solution. I would like to highlight, and I would like to mention a very concrete case. It was in July 2018. An independent judge of the higher court in a Swiss canton applied, but he did not go to the political party's HQ. He was invited in due time. Everything was done by the book. They talked, they had their interview, but they found out that he is not a member of a political party, and they told him he could go home. And it was just one newspaper to report that incident. Everyone ignored it, but now, 3 years later, everything is wonderful. But the ordinary Swiss, they lost their trust in the system. Because I'm a layman, I'm an auditor. How could I collect 130,000 votes in a short period of time? Something has to be wrong. So I said it before, political parties sell these mandates. And this is illicit because the candidate then buys a mandate that doesn't belong to the political party in the first place. So all these vacancies during the last 50 years, how were they filled? No one filed a complaint, or did they? How were they filled? But what I like about the current state of affairs is that this discussion has reached the public. People want to improve the system. We need independent, capable judges. And we need to keep them Thank you so much. Ms. Sanders, and then Stefan Breitenhof. I mean, I represent an external view. So it is more difficult for me to assess where we are in a given system. You know the Swiss perspective much better. You know what is the best path to embark on. But what can be done now? Well, I believe we can build on this culture of independence, but it is paramount for all parties involved to observe these barriers, these boundaries. And I believe that's a solid footing. I have figures from 2018. 54.2% of all Swiss say they trust the system. I still believe it is important, and it is a central advantage of this judicial initiative to have given a platform to this discussion. It has reached the public. Of course, you can always improve things. Peter?
Okay.
I would like to say one thing first. I don't agree with what Mr. Gasser said. I've been at the federal court for 30 years, not as a judge, but I've been there now for more than 30 years. And most of the cases do not have a political component. And this doesn't play any role as to where judges come from. But there are single cases. And it can be all different kinds of law, civil law, family law. There are cases where it has been politicized. And the people taking recourse to law will in the end say that this has been a politicized case. But in most cases, it does not play a role. But that's actually not a problem to me. I see it like Ms. Sanders. It's about the appearance. It's about the chilling effect. If a judge won't be influenced at all, and I believe that this is the rule, still, it's about the appearance. People might believe there is a close link between the judgeship and political parties. And if we have that appearance, then that's it. Let's say judges are biased, and there is reason to believe they're biased, and this is the end. So it's about appearance. So I understand that people believe this should be changed. My trust in politics isn't very high, and I don't believe that the Judicial Committee is willing to act on what they said. Because in the end, it's about power. It's about political power, and political parties are not willing to reduce their power. This is how I see it. That's my assessment. Mr. Voskuhle, would you like to chime in? I would like to come back to the appearance of independence, dependence. The former president of the Polish Constitutional Court and I had a long discussion. I wanted to know why the Polish Constitution is being attacked. And he said that we failed to communicate how we work, how we think, and how independent we actually are. And that is why we lacked public support. And this told me that we did not only have to look at the inside, and I know so many things are working well in Switzerland and in Germany, but still, we need to do our utmost to communicate, to reflect standards, and to explain to people why we do our work and that we do our work good. And then in times of crisis, we can count on the people's support. So this is my perspective, to shed light on the inner perspective, but also have the outer perspective and to communicate that, to tell people that we do independent work, good work, and it's also about appearance. And this is what Mrs. Sanders talked about. Despite the differences, we need to make sure that we communicate the good to the outer world, to align international standards, so we have that trust that is necessary. Wow, that would have been a very good conclusion. But I still have a question, a Swiss question. The National Council, I said it before, said on Tuesday that the initiative was rejected. So how could we continue? Can we hope that there might be changes at some point in time?
So as far as I know, this now goes to be discussed by the Council of States. And we know that the former council, Mr. Stöckli, always said that this chamber is a chamber of reflection, so maybe something's going to change. The Federal Council, Vera Rottenberg, said on the 18th of April at the University of Zurich, when she was appointed to the University of Zurich, she said that she had never experienced any influence by the party, but there was also a political pressure who was increased in the last few years and which is still increasing. So we're turning our system into a more and more centralistic and administrative state, be it in good faith or bad. But every state system needs to be backed by a judicial system that passes its ruling in according to the will of the people, not of the authority. Please, no politics here. So I support everything that supports the independence of the courts. Thank you. Peter, please. I think it's interesting and important to see that the council, the Federal Council and the Parliament say that we need to change the system. And at the same time, they don't want to do it either through the initiative or a counter proposition. It is their right to do that, but there are of course people or members of parliament who say that we get back to it. But what does it mean, getting back to it? I hope that it doesn't end up in a drawer. But I think that the members of parliament should look forward and anticipate what can happen in the future. Of course, they can take their time, but still, I think it would be good to develop a new propositions of a new system, at least in the midterm. So let's hope that the Chamber of Reflection reflects a bit on that topic. The hope dies last. Thank you very much for participating in this panel discussion. It was very interesting.